The story of what happened in Eastfield Prison begins with a night that should have been like any other. A night that the guards thought would be routine, and a night that the prisoners believed would be one more endless hour of darkness in a place already forgotten by time. Yet something about that night carried a weight, a stillness so unnatural that even the walls seemed to be holding their breath. And by the time dawn arrived, those who had survived would never speak of it again, because what they had seen and heard in those long hours could not be explained, only feared. Daniel Ross had worked as a corrections officer for 12 years, a man hardened by the screams, threats, and silence of men locked away from the world. And he thought he had seen everything Eastfield had to offer, from riots in the mess hall to suicides in the cells. But as he began his shift that evening, he noticed something wrong immediately. For the air inside the prison felt heavier than usual. The flickering lights in the corridor buzzed louder, and the chill that crept through the concrete walls seemed to follow him like an invisible shadow. He brushed it off at first, telling himself it was just another long night in a place cursed with history. For Eastfield had been built over a century ago and carried more death within its walls than any graveyard could, with executions once performed in its basement and whispers among inmates that the dead never truly left. That night, Daniel was paired with a younger guard named Kevin, who was new to Eastfield and still carried that nervous energy of a man trying to prove he could handle the job. But even Kevin's usual chatter was quieter as they made their rounds, their footsteps echoing through the corridor as though the prison itself was listening. When they passed by cell block D, Kevin frowned and asked if Daniel heard it, and at first Daniel dismissed it as the usual mutterings of inmates, until he realized that nearly every prisoner was silent, all except for one low, steady voice humming a tune that did not belong in any prison. The sound was faint, like a lullaby sung from the end of a tunnel, yet it grew louder the longer they listened, and when Daniel approached the source he stopped cold, for the cell was empty, no inmate assigned, nothing but shadows stretching across the floor, and yet the humming continued, as clear as though someone stood right there. Kevin wanted to call it in, but Daniel, stubborn and hardened, told him to keep moving, though deep inside he felt a shiver crawl across his spine that no amount of reason could shake. Midnight struck with the clang of the clock in the guardroom, and the prison grew quieter still, an oppressive silence that seemed to smother even the faintest breath. Daniel and Kevin were assigned to monitor the East Wing, a section of the prison long rumored to be haunted because it had once housed death row. And though those cells had been empty for decades, the inmates always avoided glancing that way, as if they feared even the shadows cast by its bars. As the two men walked through, the lights flickered again, plunging them into a moment of darkness so thick it felt like drowning. And when they came back on, Daniel noticed the door to cell 14 was wide open. The cell had been sealed for years, rust eating at its bars, the inside filled with dust and the faint marks of nails scratched into the stone, yet now it gaped like a wound. Daniel ordered Kevin to stand back as he shone his flashlight inside, and the beam landed on something that made his blood run cold. The cot was overturned, and on the far wall in fresh crimson letters was a message that read, "He is still here." Kevin swore it was a prank, that maybe some inmate had slipped through, but Daniel knew no one had access. And no inmate would dare write something like that in a place where legend said one execution had gone so wrong, the man's spirit refused to die. The night dragged on, but the silence in Eastfield became unbearable, broken only by the occasional rattle of metal from cells where the inmates lay awake, too frightened to sleep. Around 2 in the morning, Daniel and Kevin returned to the main corridor, only to find Officer Miller slumped in his chair at the surveillance desk, his eyes wide open but unblinking. Daniel rushed forward, shaking him, only to discover that Miller was ice cold, as though he had been dead for hours. Yet when Daniel glanced at the screens above him, the cameras showed Miller still sitting there, alive, breathing, even moving his hand to scratch his chin. Kevin whispered that it was impossible, his voice trembling, and Daniel could not answer, for he too was staring at something beyond his understanding, watching a dead man act as though he still worked his shift. The hours bled together, and every shadow seemed alive, every sound magnified until it gnawed at their sanity. The prisoners began to scream, one after another, calling out names Daniel did not recognize, begging for the voices to stop, pounding at their bars until their hands bled. And yet when Daniel tried to silence them, he realized none of them were looking at him. None of them were even acknowledging the guards, for their eyes were fixed on something in the darkness just behind him. He turned, heart pounding, but there was nothing there, only the cold air pressing against his skin like a hand. Kevin broke down then, muttering that he wanted to leave, that no job was worth this, but Eastfield's iron gates were locked until morning, and Daniel knew they were trapped. At 3, the humming returned, louder now, filling every corridor, every cell, until it seemed the walls themselves vibrated with that tune. Daniel recognized it then, a lullaby his grandmother had sung when he was a child, one he had not heard in decades, yet somehow whoever or whatever haunted Eastfield knew it. Kevin clamped his hands over his ears and cried out that it was inside his head, and Daniel pulled him along, desperate to get back to the guardroom. But the corridors twisted, leading them in circles, as though the prison itself had changed its shape. They passed the same door 3 times, cell 14, each time the message on the wall growing darker, the letters dripping as though freshly painted in blood. The last time they passed, a figure stood inside the cell, tall and thin, its face hidden in shadow, yet its eyes glowed faintly like embers in the dark. Kevin screamed and bolted, his footsteps vanishing into the maze of corridors, leaving Daniel alone, his breath ragged, his hands trembling as he turned back toward the guardroom. The figure followed, its footsteps slow and deliberate, echoing through the silence. Daniel stumbled through the halls, only to find that every door was locked, every exit sealed, until he finally collapsed against the cold stone wall, his flashlight flickering before dying completely. In the dark, he heard the humming again, so close it was as though someone stood beside his ear. And then a whisper followed, low and steady, saying his name over and over until he could no longer tell if it was his own mind breaking or a voice carried from beyond the grave. When the sun finally rose and the morning shift arrived, the gates of Eastfield creaked open, but they found the prison abandoned. The inmates sat silent in their cells, their eyes wide with terror, refusing to speak of what they had seen. Officer Miller's body was still slumped in the guardroom, but the cameras showed him moving even as the paramedics covered him with a sheet. Daniel Ross was never found, and Kevin's body was discovered weeks later at the edge of the nearby forest, his face frozen in an expression of pure horror, his ears bleeding as though the lullaby had never stopped. Eastfield Prison was shut down that very week, declared unsafe, but those who live near its crumbling walls say that when night falls and the wind is right, you can still hear the humming, drifting from its hollow corridors, a lullaby meant not to comfort, but to summon. The story of Eastfield Prison only grows darker the deeper you descend into that night. Because what followed after Kevin disappeared was not silence, but a rising tide of sounds that did not belong in any world Daniel knew. Sounds that made him question if the building itself had begun to breathe, because the walls pulsed faintly with a rhythm that felt like a heartbeat, and the pipes groaned with voices that carried no words yet spoke of hunger. Daniel forced himself to keep moving, each step dragging through corridors that felt stretched longer than they should be, the familiar layout twisting into a labyrinth where no turn led where it should. His flashlight was gone, his radio dead, and his watch had stopped at exactly 3:07, though Daniel knew by the growing ache in his legs and the sweat freezing against his neck that hours had passed since then. Somewhere in the distance, he heard Kevin's screams, echoing like they came from beneath the floor, thin and broken, then fading into a gargle before vanishing altogether, leaving only the scrape of metal against stone, a slow, dragging sound that followed him wherever he turned. The prisoners were no better off, for each time Daniel passed a block he saw faces pressed to the bars, their eyes wide and glassy, as though they were seeing something over his shoulder that he could not. Some clawed at their faces, tearing their skin until blood smeared across their cheeks. Others whispered prayers in voices so hoarse it sounded like their throats had been sanded raw. And one man simply sat rocking back and forth, his eyes fixed on the ceiling, muttering that the hanging man had returned. When Daniel demanded answers, banging his fist against the bars, the man jerked his head down with a snap that seemed to nearly break his neck, and Daniel saw bruises around his throat in the shape of a noose. The prisoner smiled with blackened teeth and said, "He never left, officer. He is still hanging. He is always hanging." Then his eyes rolled back, and his body convulsed against the cot as if strangled by an invisible rope, his legs kicking violently until his neck snapped with a crack so sharp Daniel staggered back in horror. Shaking, Daniel stumbled down another corridor, and though he knew every inch of Eastfield from years of walking it, he found himself facing doors he had never seen before, old wooden doors cracked with rot, symbols carved deep into their surfaces. One stood slightly ajar, and though every instinct screamed at him to stay away, a force stronger than fear pulled him toward it. Inside was a room he had never been told about, circular, with stone walls dripping moisture as though underground. In the center stood the rusted remains of an electric chair, leather straps still attached, and the smell of burnt flesh lingered even after decades. He had read of executions at Eastfield, how the chair had been retired after a prisoner named Thomas Vale refused to die, how the current had surged again and again, but his heart kept beating, his screams carrying through the entire block until finally, after the sixth surge, the lights of the prison blew out at once and he fell silent. They said when they went to collect his body, his eyes were still open, staring as though he was not gone. Looking now at the chair, Daniel swore he could hear the faint buzz of electricity, and in that moment he realized the humming tune he had been hearing all night was the same one Vale's mother had sung outside the courtroom before her son was sentenced to die. A sudden slam of metal tore Daniel from the room as the door behind him shut on its own, and when he spun around, the corridor was gone, replaced by rows of cells he did not recognize. Inside, shadows moved that were not human, shapes too tall, too thin, faces stretched like masks without eyes. They whispered his name, long and drawn, their arms reaching between the bars though their hands never seemed to touch the ground. Daniel ran, his boots striking against the stone, the air growing colder until each breath turned to mist. And the more he ran, the more the prison twisted into something alive, ceilings dripping with a black tar-like substance, the floorboards sagging as though the building was sinking into the earth. He stumbled into the guardroom at last, gasping in relief, but the monitors flickered with static, then cleared to show his own face on every screen. In each image he was not standing but sitting in the electric chair, his mouth open in a silent scream, his body jerking as if currents still surged through him. Daniel staggered back, overturning a chair, his heart hammering as the room plunged into darkness, and from behind him came the creak of leather straps tightening. He spun but saw no one, only the faint glow of eyes in the reflection of the monitors, a pair of burning embers watching him with hunger. A whisper filled the room, so soft it might have been his own thoughts, saying, "Sit down, Daniel. It is your turn." He bolted for the door, slamming into it with his shoulder until it gave way, and he tumbled into a stairwell he knew should not exist, spiraling downward into blackness. Each step he took, the humming grew louder, joined now by the faint hiss of static, until at the bottom he found himself in a chamber where the walls were lined with hooks, dozens of them, each carrying a body swaying slowly in the darkness. Some were guards in uniform, their faces frozen in screams. Some were inmates with their jumpsuits torn, and among them Daniel saw Kevin, his eyes wide, his mouth opening and closing as if trying to scream but no sound coming. Daniel fell to his knees, the stench of rot filling his lungs, his hands shaking as he begged for it to stop, begged for anyone to answer. But the only response was a voice rising from the dark, deeper than any human throat could produce. echoing as though the prison itself spoke. It said, "No one leaves Eastfield." The hooks began to sway faster, the bodies jerking violently, their jaws opening in unison as a single deafening scream rose, shaking the walls until dust rained from the ceiling. Daniel covered his ears, but it was inside him, tearing through his mind. And when he opened his eyes, he saw the electric chair again, now waiting in the middle of the chamber, gleaming as though new. Invisible hands seized him, dragging him toward it no matter how he fought, slamming him down against the cold metal seat. The straps bound him tight, burning against his skin, and he saw the figure step forward at last, tall and gaunt, its face half burned, eyes glowing red with hatred. And he knew this was Thomas Vale, returned from death, still carrying the rage of a man who had been killed but never allowed to rest. Vale leaned close, his voice a rasp that carried the weight of centuries of suffering, and he whispered, "Now you will know what it is to never die." The switch was thrown, and Daniel's body convulsed as the current surged through him, every nerve exploding in fire, his screams joining the chorus of all who had come before. The world shattered in white light, and then there was nothing. When morning came, the warden arrived to find the prison eerily silent. Every inmate sat stiff and pale in their cells, their eyes rolled back, their lips still humming faintly. The guards on duty were nowhere to be found. The cameras, once restored, showed only static except for one clear image, repeating over and over, of Daniel Ross sitting in the electric chair, his mouth opening in a scream that never ended. Eastfield was sealed that day, abandoned with no explanation given to the public. But those who live nearby say that on certain nights, when the wind cuts low and sharp, you can hear the humming drifting from the broken windows, followed by a chorus of screams that belong to no living soul.